man even from the dead, which gives us some insight as to why he was so willful to accept that to begin with, and why there was really no struggle in those 3 days of trying to create an excuse and change his mind at the end of it. This is faith that this is pointing to this idea that Abraham believed that God could resuscitate the dead. Even though he was going to sacrifice his only son, he knew that God, if he wanted to, could bring his son back to life. And now, a parallel that we understand with Christ as well. Because, we see that Christ is raised on the third day, very similar, like Abraham received his son back from the sentence of death at the end of the third day journey. So, in the story of Genesis 22nd, we also read a connection with Jesus' transfiguration. And remember, they're at the top of Mount Tabor. Is that Tabor? Is that good? Tabor? Okay. And the apostles hear God, the Father, said, "This is my beloved Son." And these are words that are being that are evoked. These words are being evoked in this scenario with Abraham in Mount Moriah. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love." Notice the parallel. New Testament, Old Testament. That beautiful parallel once again. And the only difference here, of course, is that God the Father did not stop the death of his beloved Son, but rather he let Jesus' self-offering fulfill all the covenants. Can you hold that comment? So let's go to the next slide. Abraham, of course, had no idea that from his actions this would foreshadow the day of the ultimate blessing through Jesus. But even in his words to Isaac, the Lord would provide himself the lamb, not a lamb, but the lamb, come through Christ. We can't ignore that. And interesting, God provides the lamb, which is Christ, at the very place that it's going to make the sacrifice, in Moriah. Now, later in Israel's history, we know that the Temple of Jerusalem was built in Moriah. And we know this through a reference through 2 Chronicles 3:1. And there the people of Israel offered their sacrifices following this tradition, and in effect reminding God of his promise to Abraham. And the need for the sacrifice comes to an end, obviously, when Christ is sacrificed in Calvary. Which, by the way, do you happen to know where Calvary took place? In one of the peaks of Moriah. Calvary is taking place in one of the peaks of Moriah, where Abraham is committed to do his sacrifice for his son, and where the temple is doing all this sacrifice. Beautiful parallel. Just the story continues. Next slide, please. So before we move on, let's find out how Abraham's descendants managed to get themselves enslaved in Egypt. It's important to understand. Remember that bondage in the promise, this bondage thing. What was that all about? How they managed to get themselves enslaved by Egypt. And let's briefly review the promises and oath of God's covenants with Abraham. So notice this beautiful slide over here. So remember, Genesis 12, 3 promises are made. Hey, I'm gonna give you a nation. I'm gonna give you a great name, a royal dynasty, and a worldwide blessing. Okay? And here are the 3 references of that through Genesis. Those are the 3 promises that are made, who then are upgraded and strengthened to covenants. In Genesis 15, we see that God swears an oath to Abraham's descendants that will be delivered from bondage from a foreign nation and give them the promised land. That's the Mosaic covenant, which will come next lesson through Moses. And in Genesis 17, we see that God swears that kings will come forth from both Abraham and Sarah. Great kings will come from you. And we see this, the Davidic covenant, which will be covered. It's the 5th covenant through the Davidic covenant. And then in Genesis 22nd, we see how God swears that all the nations shall be blessed through Abraham's descendants, his seed. Not some, but all of them. And obviously, this is the new covenant through Jesus Christ, which we'll end this series with. Next slide, please. So, when you look at that slide and when you look at those three arms, it really emphasizes what Abraham is such an important figure in the story of the Bible. It's such a strong prelude to what's going to happen next. Not as strong. It's a very clear prelude. I mean, it's being written down there. This is what's going to happen, buddy. Here's what we're going to do. God will provide himself. Is that the next slide? Wait. Okay. I lost track. Sorry. We're in the right slide. I get excited about this. Sorry. So, Abraham's son had, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. I don't know how to pronounce that. Esau. Okay. And just as God chose Abraham's younger son, Isaac, rather than his older son, Ishmael, we keep seeing this trend. The blessing is being passed down to the younger son, not the older son. And I think it's important to highlight that because this subplot, this instant runs throughout the Bible in more than one instance. It's highly repetitive, and it really ties to this idea that you and I, we all think, right? If it was man's will, we usually make the first son be the inheritor, right? The one who's going to be offered. And God is almost like saying, no, I'm making the younger. You know, it sort of references the whole idea of the Tower of Babel again. When you do it your way, that's fine. You'll get somewhere over here. But when you do it my way, you get over here. You get a very specific blessing. So this whole concept of turning the world upside down. What you and I think for our standards, our temporal standards, God is just turning it upside down and saying, how is that going to work out? Well, it's going to work out because I'm God. I'm doing this. Okay? Let's go to the next slide, please. And we see that there's, this whole concept, what are the first son doing? Well, we know what Adam did, right? The firstborn of creation. He fell into pride. And virtually you see this trend all over the Bible, that the older sons in the Bible are failing in a similar way. And pride tends to be like the main culprit. And we see this trend. But, more importantly, it's this whole concept of flipping the world upside down, flipping the argument upside down. So God continues to choose the younger ones instead of the older ones. And in fact, we have a reference here to St. Paul, who makes this clear when he promises in Romans 9 that God chose the younger over the elder in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of his call. So it's not dependent on man's will or assertion, but upon God's mercy. Again, he falls back into this concept that on your own terms, you could go a distance, but on God's terms, you're going to go the whole way. Let's go to the next slide. So in the rest of the history, we see that beside this whole concept of the younger being chosen over the elder, do you remember what happens to Abraham's offsprings? Well, let's start off with Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson and Isaac's son, and how he gets a new name. And then, just as his grandfather was changed, Abraham to Abraham, Jacob's name is changed to what? Israel. Fantastic. And how many sons does Israel have? 12 sons, who eventually become the fathers of what? The 12 tribes. And before that happens, you need to backtrack to understand the story right there. Those 12 sons they make their way into Egypt, and how the story happens is very well elaborated in the book of Genesis towards the end. That will lead to Exodus. Let's go to the next slide. And to make it short, Israel gives one of his younger sons, Joseph, a very beautiful coat. And his older brothers become jealous, and they basically sell him into slavery. And he ends up being in Egypt, but obviously through he ends up being a slave, but through God's mercy, he's given a gift to interpret dreams, and he uses his gift to explain a dream to the Pharaoh about a coming famine, right? The whole 7 years of wealth, and then 7 years of famine. 7 again, the number 7, the correlations of the number 7, not to be ignored. And as this happened, Pharaoh makes him the prime minister. And there's this very subtle reference over there about Pharaoh giving him the keys of the kingdom, which correlates to something else that happens down the road when Jesus gives the keys of the kingdom to who? To Peter. Specifically to Peter. So, if you ever want to understand this whole concept of authority and why is authority given to Peter, you could look into this passage of Genesis and understand how Pharaoh is giving the keys of the kingdom to Joseph. And what does that entail? The administrative tasks that entails, the responsibilities that entail, the powers that it entails, the authority that it entails. Because it's only by understanding from the historical perspective what this whole concept of giving the keys of the kingdom are, that we could then make sense to what is happening in the New Testament when Jesus is giving the keys of the kingdom to Peter. What is that all about? Oh, you could get the answer to that here. The keys, Pharaoh gives Joseph the keys of the kingdom, and that entails something very specifically. All right, let's go to the next story. The next slide. Yeah, Joseph basically wisdom spare Egypt from famine, and not only Egypt but the rest of the region itself. And accordingly, Joseph's brothers, just like many other people, they came to Egypt to buy food, and the family is reunited. It's a very beautiful story. And obviously, instead of returning home to the land of God gave them, however, all the brothers remain in Egypt, living in luxury. Okay? So they were in their land, and then they all transfer now back to Egypt to live in luxury. Because, hey, Joseph he has the keys of the kingdom. He's the guy. Okay? So this life of luxury eventually turns into a life of misery. When the new Pharaoh takes over, who doesn't know or remember Joseph, at least that's how it's being explained, and they begin to see the Hebrew people as a threat. The dynamics, right? The change. Hey, Abraham, take your people, live luxury, go into a nomadic lifestyle. Okay, so they do that. They're in alignment, they're in obedience. Then they leave. They trade that lifestyle for luxury, and they go back. And now they go into the land of Egypt, the powerful Egypt. Here they are themselves taking control and making a different decision. And what are the consequences of that? Oh, now you're slaves. Again, the point that I'm trying to correlate here is the difference between what happens when you do things on your own terms versus how you do it in God's way. What happens when you align yourself to your own will versus what happens when you align yourself into God's will, and the consequence, the ramification of those two options. So I think this is the last slide. In Egypt here, as they begin to wait for deliverance, the Hebrews find hope in God's word to Joseph. And those words are, God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Your fathers being Abraham, the land of your fathers. And obviously, if we go way back into Genesis 15, we see that God had also promised Abraham that he will deliver them from slavery, bondage, right? The word bondage again. And he will bring him back to the promised land. He will bring him back to the promised land. So the Israel, keep hope, because Joseph reminds them of this. And it's not a question of how, it's a question of when it's going to happen. So that remains the ultimate. Like, when is this going to happen? So in the next lesson, next Wednesday, we're going to look about we're going to talk about the arrival of this promise to help, of the coming back through Moses, to help the Hebrews get free from bondage, free from slavery, and back into their father's land, the promised land, and how God intercedes through Moses. That's going to be the fourth covenant that we're going to be talking about. So with that, I end the lecture, and I open it up to discussion. I know we had some really great points that we wanted to bring. Remember how I told you at the beginning? How was Abraham answering to a higher calling? What were the traits of answering to the higher calling? So let's spend 10 minutes in our tables. Let's talk about it, and then let's come back together and talk about it as a group.